Okay, picture this. It's December 1944. Europe is frozen solid. On the border of Germany and Belgium, the Third Reich is literally crumbling. You've got the Allies pushing in from the west, the Soviets barreling in from the east. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the war looks like it's over. But in that bitter cold, something is happening. Germany is secretly pulling together its very last reserves of men, of tanks, of fuel, for one final, absolutely monumental gamble. An offensive so audacious, so completely desperate, that the goal was to change the entire course of the war in one single knockout blow. This was the Battle of the Bulge. And to really get why it was lost before it even truly began, we have to start not with some grand strategy map, but with the quiet doubts of the men who were actually there on the front line. So our story doesn't begin in some high-command bunker. No, it starts in a lieutenant's diary. On the very eve of the attack, as tanks are rumbling past him in the dark, a German officer named Hans Miller writes down these words. Think about that for a second. He sees all this incredible hardware. He hears the big promises of a history-making victory, but he also knows a devastating truth. He knows the numbers just don't add up. And the most chilling part? He has this gut feeling that every single soldier around him, deep down, knows it too. And that really brings us to the central question of this entire battle, doesn't it? This goes way beyond tactics and logistics. It gets right to the heart of human psychology, of hope, and, yeah, of delusion. If the guys on the ground could sense that this plan was a long shot at best, why did they climb into their tanks? Why did they drive into that forest? To understand why they did it, we first have to understand the sheer fantasy of the plan they were ordered to carry out. The plan itself had a code name, Wacht am Rhein, which means watch on the Rhine. It was designed to trick the Allies into thinking it was purely defensive. But this plan was conceived top to bottom by Adolf Hitler himself. His vision was to punch 3 entire German armies through a part of the Allied line everyone thought was quiet, the Ardennes Forest, then race 125 miles to the port of Antwerp. The goal? Split the American and British forces in two and hopefully force them to sue for peace. You know, it was exactly the kind of lightning strike that had won him France back in 1940. The problem was, 1944 was not 1940, not even close.
And this is where you see this fatal disconnect. A complete break between the vision coming from the very top and the reality that the commanders on the ground were living with every single day. When Hitler laid out this plan, his most seasoned generals, guys like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, they were reportedly just stunned into silence. They saw what Hitler either couldn't or wouldn't see. This wasn't a military plan. It was a fantasy built on hope, not logistics. A plan that just completely ignored the basic mathematics of modern war.
So let's break this down because it's like 2 different worlds. On one side, you have Hitler's assumptions. He was absolutely convinced that sheer willpower, pure fighting spirit, could make up for a lack of fuel and bullets. He was literally banking on a week of terrible weather to keep the all-powerful Allied Air Force on the ground. And he held this deep-seated belief that American soldiers were soft and would just break and run. But on the other side, you had the general's grim reality. They knew they didn't have enough fuel. They knew their new divisions were full of teenagers and old men. And they had learned the hard way, over and over again, to never underestimate American resilience.
Okay, so let's get into the math that Lieutenant Miller was writing about in his diary. The first number you absolutely have to understand is this one, 30 to 40 miles. That's it. German staff officers calculated that this was the absolute maximum distance their best armored units, the spearheads of the attack, could go before their tanks ran completely dry. Just let that sink in. They were about to launch the most ambitious offensive of the war with basically less than a tank of gas.
And this is where the math just becomes a total delusion. Their ultimate objective, the port of Antwerp, was 125 miles away. So how do you travel 125 miles when you've only got 40 miles worth of fuel? Well, the entire plan, the fate of 250,000 men and all of Germany's remaining tanks, it all rested on one single incredibly desperate hope: that they would capture American fuel dumps along the way, completely intact. The whole offensive was, quite literally, running on fumes and a prayer.
And then, on December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, the gamble began. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened up, and under the cover of thick fog and snow, the attack achieved total, complete surprise. The initial shock was just overwhelming. The American lines, mostly held by green troops or guys who were exhausted from previous fighting, just shattered. For a few wild, frantic days, it really seemed like the impossible might actually happen.
And the success was, well, it was stunning. In the center of the German attack, one of their panzer armies just blew right through the American 106th Infantry Division, surrounding 2 of its regiments. Almost 9,000 American soldiers were forced to surrender. It was the single largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe for the entire war. For the Allies, it was a catastrophe. And on the maps back at German headquarters, it looked like the decisive breakthrough they'd been dreaming of. For a moment, the gamble looked like it was paying off big time.
But then, just one day into this apparent success, something happened that changed the entire nature of the battle. Near a little crossroads outside a town called Malmedy, an elite SS unit, the very tip of the German spearhead, captured about 120 American soldiers. They were marched into a field, and then the SS troops opened fire with machine guns, executing the unarmed prisoners in the snow.
You know, in war, news travels fast, but bad news travels even faster. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire through the American lines, and the effect was immediate, it was profound. The initial shock and confusion of the surprise attack, it transformed almost overnight into a cold, hard, unyielding rage. American soldiers who might have considered surrendering when they were outnumbered and overwhelmed now fought to the last man. Every single village, every crossroads became a fortress. The massacre essentially guaranteed that the Americans would not break. They would not give one more inch of ground if they could help it.
This new, hardened American resistance, born out of pure fury, was really the first sign that the German plan was in trouble. And very soon, all the other fundamental flaws that the generals had worried about from the very beginning, the lack of fuel, the overstretched supply lines, underestimating their enemy, all of it started to catch up with the German advance. Reality was about to bite back and bite back hard. You know, German tank crews started using this term, steel coffins. That's what their incredible Tiger and Panther tanks became the second their fuel gauges hit empty. A tank without gas is just a 50-ton steel target. It can't advance, it can't retreat, it just sits there waiting to be destroyed by artillery or planes. And all across the Ardennes, more and more of Germany's best, most feared weapons were becoming just that, steel coffins. You can almost see the entire story of the battle's failure right here in this short timeline. You've got the stunning success on the 16th, then the huge psychological turning point on the 17th with the massacre. A few days later, at the vital road junction of Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne gives their legendary reply to a German surrender demand. Nuts. And then comes December 24th, the one day the German high command had been absolutely dreading. The weather cleared.
Hitler's gamble on the weather was over. On Christmas Eve, the skies above the Ardennes just filled with Allied aircraft. We're talking over 5,000 missions flown in a single day. Fighter bombers, which the Germans called J-bows, roamed the skies like birds of prey, hunting anything that moved on the roads below. And they systematically destroyed the German supply columns, going after the precious fuel trucks first, making absolutely sure that those armored spearheads would grind to a permanent halt. The story of that one SS battle group, Kampfgruppe paper, is basically a perfect miniature of the entire offensive. This was supposed to be the most powerful unit, the absolute tip of the spear. They broke through, they drove deep into Belgium, and then they ran out of gas. Just like that. They got cut off, surrounded, pounded by artillery, and they waited for fuel and reinforcements that were never going to come. In the end, about 800 survivors had to abandon their multi-million-dollar tanks and just walk back to their own lines. The spearhead was broken. So, by early January, the offensive had completely fizzled out. The Germans were being pushed back on all fronts. The bulge they had created in the Allied lines was being squeezed from the north and the south. And now, it was time to tally the final, absolutely catastrophic cost of this delusional gamble.
The numbers on this balance sheet, they really tell the whole story. I mean, at first glance, you might look at the casualties and think, well, they look kind of comparable. But look closer. The real story, the crucial difference, is in those two words, replaceable versus exhausted. Yes, the Allies lost thousands of men and hundreds of tanks, but America's industrial power could and would replace every single one. Germany's losses of its best soldiers, its veteran pilots, its heavy tanks, they were absolutely positively irreplaceable. They had pushed all their chips onto the table, and they lost every last one. So in the end, the Battle of the Bulge didn't just fail to achieve its wild objectives, it actively destroyed Germany's ability to even defend itself. The precious fuel reserves that had taken months and months to stockpile, gone. The last mobile, effective panzer divisions, shattered. And the very forces that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front to face the massive Soviet offensive that was about to launch, well, those forces were now lying wrecked and abandoned in the forests of Belgium. And you don't have to take it from me. This is the final verdict. And it comes not from a historian, but from a German commander who actually lived through the chaos. He wrote that the entire plan was based on this insane assumption that courage could be substituted for gasoline. He called it exactly what it was, not military strategy, but magical thinking. It's this belief that if you just wish for something hard enough, reality itself will bend to your will. And, as he correctly points out, it was this magical thinking that ultimately left Germany defenseless. So after all that death and destruction, what did this last desperate gamble actually achieve? Well, it delayed the final Allied push into Germany by about 6 weeks. That's it. And for that 6-week delay, Germany sacrificed its last field army, it guaranteed it could never launch another major attack, and it left Berlin wide open for the Red Army. In trying to prevent defeat, the offensive only ensured that the final defeat would be faster, more catastrophic, and utterly unconditional. And that really leaves us with this final thought. The Battle of the Bulge, yes, it's a stark military lesson about logistics and strategy. But it's also a timeless human story about the profound danger of self-delusion. It's about what happens when leaders, or even entire companies or countries, decide to substitute wishful thinking for hard facts, when they demand that sheer willpower alone should overcome physical reality. So the question I'll leave you with is this. Where do you see this pattern playing out today? Because this tendency to believe that the math, that reality doesn't apply to us, well, that's a gamble that history shows time and time again very rarely pays off.